The arson investigation meant that the causes of the Murrindindi fire were never considered by the Bushfires Royal Commission.
The Royal Commission was faced with a circumstance where there was a police investigation on foot, and they didn't want to interfere with that investigation.
After the Kilmore East case is concluded, Maurice Blackburn will lead another class action, alleging that the fatal Murrindindi fire was also started by a preventable power line failure.
The case is also against SP AusNet, and we allege that in that particular circumstance the fire was caused because, again, a power line broke and as it fell across a fence, electrified that fence, and then that fence caused arcing with vegetation, which caused the fire.
SP AusNet's defence is that its power line did not start the fire. And even if it did, the company could have done nothing to prevent it.
The fire was fairly close towards the fence, but there was a very strong north wind that was pushing it away from us at the gateway. We went in and attempted to attack the fire on the right-hand side here. It's over here.
On Black Saturday, Murrindindi's current CFA captain, Roger Kirkham, was on the first truck to reach the fire.
As we were driving out this gate, Jared yelled to me, "Be careful, I've just driven over a power line on the ground." And I looked back and I could see the power line lying on the ground and heading towards the road here. And I heard later that it was also across the road.
Roger Kirkham believes the most obvious potential cause of the fire was too quickly disregarded.
What do you think caused the fire?
I think the fact that the power line was on the ground here and that I guess evidence would point to the fact that the power line's on the ground, there's a chance it could have arced, and if it had arced along the fence line, then it could have caused the fire to start along the fence line or back further to where it had started, where we took the truck into the paddock at the first instance.
Do you think attention was brought to bear on that possibility soon enough?
I think there was a lot of attention given to the fact that the fire could have been deliberately lit, and perhaps there could have been more attention placed on the possibility of the fire being lit by arcing power lines.
Four Corners has spoken with other local residents who live near the power substation which sits alongside the Murrindindi mill. They did not want to be interviewed on camera, but several reported hearing loud bangs coming from the substation area just before the fire started on Black Saturday.
The community are almost convinced that it must have had something to do with that. They're pretty much certain of it in their minds.
CFA volunteer Stan Banbury watched the fire take off from a hill above the substation.
With hearing noises and the power being out at that stage and then reportedly coming on and going off, everything appears to point to the power lines in anecdotal things that happened on the day.
In the end, the police dropped the arson theory. They discovered that two crucial pieces of evidence had been missed.
They noticed an extraordinary coincidence in the accounts of various witnesses on the day as to the timing of the start of the fire and when the power had been switched back on. So the power had gone off at around about midday, and then at around about 2:45 the power was switched back on by SP AusNet employees, and at that point, very, very shortly after, the fire commenced.
The police also realised that Ron Philpott was at home on the phone when the fire ignited.
They didn't come out and say that it was the electricity company, but may have insinuated it.
And did they apologise to you for the way for their investigation into you, and has anyone apologised to you?
No, I haven't had an apology from any of them. Media, police, nobody.
Along with 2 deaths in the Beechworth blaze, the fires which began at Kilmore East and Murrindindi on the 7th of February 2009 took 161 lives. That's 93% of the deaths on Black Saturday. The evidence is mounting that power lines caused all those fires.
I think the public policy in terms of trying to make the system safer in future has to take those rather scary, those overwhelming figures into account.
Michael Gunter was one of the first people to be convinced that electricity failures were also responsible for the Murrindindi blaze. He experienced Black Saturday over the radio from Melbourne and found it traumatic.
There was a sort of a media frenzy after Black Saturday blaming greenies and lack of fuel reduction burning, and particularly arsonists.
The horror of that day turned the former doctor into an enthusiastic investigator of the electricity industry.
Somewhere along the line it was obvious that at least one of the major fires had been lit by power lines, and yet the media story and the general perception in the public seemed to be that it was all the fault of nasty, deranged arsonists.
Michael Gunter closely followed the Victorian Bushfires Royal Commission and its canvassing of past inquiries.
Still conduct a badly rusted history of falling down.
There was an excellent report done by Sir Esla Barber to the government in 1977 after some fatal bushfires and grass fires right across the state.
The Barber inquiry was the first formal examination to establish a certain link between power lines and devastating bushfires.
What the report found was that the SEC had been, which was the state-owned electricity utility at the time, had been telling farmers and rural people for many years that their power lines couldn't cause fires.
This series of tests carried out on a normal low-voltage line at Camberwell shows clearly the amount and trajectory of particles emitted as a result of the conductors clashing.
Michael Gunter uncovered a long-forgotten film buried deep within Victoria's State Archive. On it was footage of tests revealing that the then State Electricity Commission, or SEC, knew that clashing power lines could cause bushfires as far back as 1974.
The incandescent particles are visible even in broad daylight, and it can be seen that in some cases they reach the ground with sufficient heat to cause a fire under the right fuel and weather conditions.
The SEC's tests convinced the Barber inquiry to make a series of recommendations.
When a tree branch contacts a high voltage line, the effect is even more startling.
It called for more fuel reduction and vegetation control to prevent trees touching power lines.
In the field, the effects could be much worse if conditions were conducive to a fire. It took only 40 seconds from the time the branch touched the wires until it fell in flames to the ground.
The inquiry also favoured technological improvements in fuse design and putting spreaders on power lines to stop them from clashing. However, the Barber report concluded that
if the future measures are not adequate, then, almost as a policy of despair, resource may well have to be had to the turning off of all power on days of potential danger.
Just 6 years later, such a day came again, on the 16th of February 1983. The power stayed on. The result was Ash Wednesday, then the deadliest fires the nation had ever seen. It defined the terrifying potential of bushfires for a whole generation of Australians.
It's the fastest travelling fire in the world. 17 kilometres an hour. We had no hope of getting nearer.
Strong winds stoked unprecedented firestorms after a spell of unrelentingly hot and dry weather. 75 people were killed that day, 47 in Victoria and 28 in South Australia.
Came very close, covered the whole foothills of Adelaide and as well as the southeast of South Australia. So it was a very extensive and catastrophic bushfire that occurred.
What is often forgotten now is that more than half of Ash Wednesday's deaths were caused by fires started by power lines. In South Australia, power line fires accounted for every death.
After the Ash Wednesday bushfires, there was a number of coronial inquests into the bushfires because of the extensive amount of lives lost, and part of that looked at electricity infrastructure as the cause of a number of the fires and how that could be minimised.
After wreaking destruction either side of the border, Ash Wednesday forced both Victoria and South Australia to commit to extensive programs of bushfire mitigation.
Americans recall exactly what they were doing the day Kennedy was gunned down. And Victorians, well, they remember Ash Wednesday.
3 years after Ash Wednesday, in 1986, the SEC produced this film to help convince insurers overseas that Victoria was now committed to making its power lines safer. This film was discovered this year in the State Archive by Michael Gunter.
I think that all of us at the senior management ranks are absolutely committed to ensuring that we never again have an experience like that. It's almost like a war against an enemy.
The SEC again emphasises its tree clearing programs and technological improvements to power lines, power poles and fuses.
Clashing conductors were identified clearly as one of the prime causes in the 83 inquests. Since then, we've virtually eliminated clashing conductors through three mechanisms. Firstly, keeping trees clear. Secondly, fitting spreaders into spans of low voltage. And thirdly, eliminating, where we can, any low voltage conductors out of the system.
But there's an implicit admission here that even with the best technology and maintenance, power lines can still cause bushfires in Victoria.
If a day of extreme fire danger should arise, we can actually disconnect that area from supply.
And have you had to switch off in the past?
No, we haven't had to at this stage, because at the same time it's identified, it's also given the highest possible priority to ensure that the work is completed before days of extreme fire danger start.